Good afternoon and welcome to Conversations on Showing Up for Kids. My name is Tim Markle. I'm director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs. And this is an informal, casual time that we get to talk about information that might be important to parents and family members with children with special healthcare needs. Want to remind everybody who might be on the call today that we are recording this call. Please do not use any identifiable health information or personal information that you do not want out on the web for everybody to hear. Also let you know that I am not a doctor. I am not a lawyer. This is not expert advice. This is people talking together to try to make the system a little bit better. I am very excited today to welcome in not just a colleague, but someone that I also believe to be a friend. And I'm really excited to introduce you all to her today and the organization that she works with. And so we're welcoming Lynn Renner, who works with Family Voices of Wisconsin. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you. I am excited to be with you today.
So tell us a little bit about Family Voices of Wisconsin. It's a cool name. What are you guys all about?
Okay, well, we are the state affiliate of the National Family Voices organization that started almost 30 years ago. And literally, it started with a group of parents around a kitchen table and thinking about how do we make the voices of families heard on the national, state, and local level. And what they found was happening in healthcare, in policy, on the federal and local legislative level, that a lot of times the experiences and the voices of families were not being heard. So, and actually we have a couple of our board members who were there almost 30 years ago, who were, young parents of children with disabilities who really wanted to be a part of systems change.
So that's another part of Family Voices that I know, at least in Wisconsin. I don't know if it's nationwide, but I know with Wisconsin, y'all are also family members or parents or family members of children with special health care needs. So not only is this an organization for Family Voices, it's an organization of those family voices.
Exactly. And that's very much true across the state. Sorry, let me take this. And across the nation, that we are all families who have kids with special health care needs. I have a son who's 19, who's in the transition program here in Madison. So I've kind of lived it. And so I think that's really what drew me about 10 years ago to working for this organization, because I knew the struggles. I knew that navigating systems it's tricky and it changes, right? I mean, you go from birth to 3 to early childhood to your child's IEP in school. And now I'm kind of taking the next step into transition. So there's just a lot to learn. And I think learning from families, and that's really what we're all about. We're, from federal funding from HRSA, we're designated as the Family to Family Health Information Center. So we are definitely here to bring the voices of families to policymakers, but also to learn together. And we think of ourselves as a network of parents and of families.
And I love that sense of network. And I love the fact that it's parents and family members, not just, you have that one-to-one connection, which is fantastic. And you can have that group connection, but you're also looking at the bigger system about family voices, not just on the local system, not just in school, but in legislature, in policy, in budget making. And you have an event coming up, Advocacy for Change, that helps parents to enter into that sort of world, because that's not a world that many parents sit there and go, oh, I just cannot wait to go talk to my legislator. It's something I've always wanted to do. Very rarely does that happen, but it's necessary for family voices to be heard in those places as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the event coming up?
Sure. So it's our 10th year, and exactly what you were saying. It really is a time and a space for families to get together, to learn some skills, to practice their skills, to learn some strategies, and how does your voice, your family story, or a slice of your family story impact, and how can you impact policies and systems? And so we started off having it every other year budget cycle. In Wisconsin, we have a biennial budget cycle. And then we found that really every year there are legislative priorities, there are policy changes that really impact how we care for our children. So we've now had it every year for, I guess, last 8 years. So this year it is March 30th and 31st. Because of COVID, we are having it virtually. But our plan is to go back to making it an in-person event if we can safely next year. So what we try to do is reach out to as many families from Northwest, Southwest, all over the state. And again, when it's not virtual, we bring them to Madison and we have a full morning and early afternoon of training. And again, this year we're going to make it 2 half days, but to bring them together and to talk about, number one, why is their voice important and why are family stories really important? And we know from talking to legislators that that's what people really remember, is not the, of course, lobbyists have a lot of money and a lot of time to impact or to, talk to legislators. But for families, it's all about telling your legislator how, maybe they're going to increase funding, or maybe there've been budget cuts at, for your child's special education program. Maybe, we want something to be covered by Medicaid. Maybe, there are so many things that happen legislatively. Maybe, you are able to hire personal care and respite workers, but the pay is horrible, which is what many of us expect, right? So, trying to increase funding so that those personal care and respite workers can be paid more. So those are all examples where your stories really can make a difference. And that's what can make, legislators change their mind or add something or add money to the budget. So anyway, so what I was going to say is that we bring people together. We talk about the budget priorities for that year. And then we also tell them specifically, we have an issue briefing time where we have policy experts come in and talk about, in special ed, in children's mental health, and in children's long-term supports, what's happening, what's in the budget, or maybe what's not in the budget that we really want legislators to know about. And then we spend some time one-on-one with people, having them take that slice of their family story and pairing it to a specific ask. So that's where we really spend most of our time and most of our energy. And we have a lot of tools on our website, and I can show you guys in a little bit, what's on our website. We have a great worksheet, and then we have a worksheet with examples to say, okay, let's think about what's going on. Let's think about your slice of your family experience, your story, and then how can you, in a very succinct way, make a message, create a message, and then maybe translate into testimony to send to the Joint Finance Committee at, sometime soon, to say, this is who I am. I'm your constituent. This is why you should be listening to me. This is, I have a child with this, at this age, this disability, my family is, lucky to have this, or, we are covered by this program, or my child's at this school and gets special ed services. This is my experience with those services. And then to take that and say, this is my ask. This is why increasing funding for, whether it's saying, we don't have enough nurses in our schools, we need more school social workers, or, I need more funding for, so I can pay my respite workers better. So it's kind of taking all what you've learned and then putting it into a succinct package to say, this is really my message to legislators. So that's kind of the day.
Wow. I just love that, because what I'm hearing you say is that, you don't have to go out and spend time before you come to Advocacy for Change doing all sorts of research on the policies and how the budget works. Is you guys will bring in experts to help them understand the issues and focus in on some issues. And then you'll also help them craft their story so that the two can go together. So you're really helping people through a step-by-step process of connecting those two systems, the family with the budget and the legislators that control the money, which is where we want the family voices to be heard.
Exactly. And I think the other piece that's really important that, you know, I can think about so many experiences where people have met during advocacy for change.
Oh,
people together
yeah,
who are right. We're the family to family group. We are all parents. We've gone through this, right? So we're bringing people together who are interested in advocacy, in, you know, family leadership, in bringing their voice, not just about their own child, but about how about all the children in my school district? How about all the kids across the state who none of us can find personal care workers, you know, or whatever the issue is, to say, I'm going to bring the voice of all families across Wisconsin. And we've had some awesome experiences where people met, you know, when it was face to face, we would, you know, get together over lunch and say, you know, I'm from Bayfield and I'm from Platteville, and maybe you're from Milwaukee, but we're all interested in this issue. And, you know, the example is that I think about is several years ago on the federal level, there was a lot of discussion about block granting Medicaid, which really could have meant huge, deep cuts in Medicaid. And I think a lot of legislators don't understand what a critical piece that is for families of kids with disabilities. How many, you know, not just they're going to the doctor, but how their community supports, whether you're a child, whether it's employment for your transition age child. Medicaid is huge, right? For that our kids can live in their community. So these group of moms got together, joined it. They had a Facebook group, they communicated for a while, and then they all got together and met, I think this was virtually, you know, over the phone with their US congressmen to talk about and share their family stories about how block granting and huge cuts in Medicaid would be devastating for them personally and for their communities. So
I think it's so much easier.
This is kind of a jumping off. We're hoping that it kind of stirs the pot, right? And gets people excited about advocacy. It's just one day, and this year it's 2 half days, but it's really kind of, we want people to feel empowered and to demystify the whole idea of advocacy, so that people can, you know, end that one-on-one connection, so that, you know, maybe it's in 6 months from now or in a year from now, but people will say, you know what, I knew that person and they're passionate about this thing too. And so let's get together and let's call our legislator, or let's invite him or her to a community event, or maybe we're going to see him or her at the 4th of July parade in our community. You know what, let's be there at the same time and remind him, you know, who we are and what's important to us, and so that he'll remember our family story. So that's, I think, really for me, that's my ultimate goal, is for people to feel like they can come here, learn, but then kind of, you know, move on, and find ways to advocate. And I guess one other thing I was going to say is that we have had a few people who have told us that this kind of sparked their interest in running for office. So I think it's totally cool that we've had a couple of people that are now on their local school boards because they went to Advocacy for Change. The whole thing was kind of demystified. They realized, you know what, my voice is just important as anybody else's. And, you know, maybe rather than being mad at the system or frustrated with the system, maybe I should be a part of the board that makes decisions. So I find that really cool too.
I think all of that is fantastic. So let's go ahead and we're going to look at, if you want to bring up some of the stuff from Family Voices that you wanted to look at. Sure. I think one of the really cool things that you also talked about is that advocacy doesn't have to be a solo activity. I love the stories of those people, you know, coming together around one issue and then talking as a group. They tell their individual stories, but they're there supporting each other. They're there to help each other out and to encourage and to help them refine. And policy isn't something you want to do alone. It really should be a team sport. And so I really love the way you bring families together around advocacy and around policy. I think that's really cool too. So go ahead and tell us what it is that we're looking at.
Okay, so this is our Family Voices website, and I encourage you all to go and look at the website. We have tons of great resources. I might not go there right now, but we have a resource library, and we have over 30 fact sheets. We have online trainings.
Can I just stop you for a minute about the
Sure.
fact sheets? Let's just talk briefly about the fact sheets, because I love the fact sheets, because the way that I describe the fact sheets is it translates legislative talk and policy talk into family language, into ways that families can understand what they are. And I just think that's one of the coolest things, because so many times we just have links of, go to this page, it'll tell you all about this program. But you get there and the language is written such that you just can't make heads or tails of it. And it drives me absolutely, it just makes me I don't like it. And so you guys take some of those and you make it so people like me can understand them. I love that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly our point, is to kind of take the jargon, the legalese, the, kind of sometimes what DHS or DPI or other agencies need to, they have to put it in their legal language, but we can kind of take that and translate it into a question and answer sort of thing, or really being families. And we also, a lot of our fact sheets come from hearing from families at trainings, through the regional centers like yours, Tim, like what is confusing, what doesn't work. So we take those, kind of from that family perspective and write quick 2-page fact sheets that also give a lot more, to learn more, go here, see this agency, go here, go there, but, or, call this person, but really can give you the nuts and bolts of, things like, does my child qualify for diapers? Well, yes, but, you have to think about age 4 and, okay, well, maybe they qualify, but then what? What does that mean? Like, how do I, I'm eligible, but how do I actually get them? And what does that, so what does that look like? So I think those are the sorts of things. And you can see we have a series on children's long-term supports, and that goes from, a general, what is CLTS, to, is my child eligible? So they're eligible. So now what? And kind of brings you through all the stages of having a child who could qualify for long-term supports.
So this is, I know this is a horrible question to ask, Lynn. It's something you should never ask family members, but you have so many fact sheets right now. Is there one besides the children's long-term support waivers that you're like most proud of, or that really took a complex issue and brought it into families' language, or just one that you're personally like, this is like my favorite fact sheet? We'll never tell people who our favorite children are, but do you have a favorite fact sheet, or one that just strikes you as this was important? This took a lot of work, but it was worth it.
Let's see. Ooh, that's hard. Honestly, I think because I'm personally going through transition with my son, I think some of our newer ones on transition have been really timely and really helpful. So, some of the transition, the health coverage options for transition age youth, some of the, we have one on working with a fiscal employer agent and working with an IRIS consultant. So for me, those were totally unknown. And again, I've now worked in the field for 10 years, but they're saying, oh, guess what? Your son's not going to be in the nice supported hands of your CLTS worker anymore. You have to choose between IRIS and family care. And by the way, you're going to have this new worker, but they're totally different. They're not really like a case manager anymore. They can do some things, they can't do other things. It's all self-directed. And like, oh my God, what does that really mean?
Right. So, it's a whole new world. And
it definitely is.
The fact that you have these fact sheets to help parents prepare for that world, so they don't just get to 18 when everything changes and then they're stuck going, what is this place? Where have I ended up? Is these fact sheets can help them prepare for that transition.
Exactly.
I love that.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to show you our
got?
Advocacy for Change page. We worked
awesome.
really hard on this. And as I was saying to you, Tim, before, in the past, it was a live event, and it was awesome to all be in the same room to hear from policy experts. We have loved having Lynn Breedlove, who's really nationally known as being he gives a advocacy pep talk about really why our family voice is important. So we've heard from him, but it was just for those 35 or 40 families who were able to come to our training. And this year we pre-recorded that keynote. We've pre-recorded a lot of information. So it's, it's kind of more accessible now. So I'm excited about that. So anyway, so this is our, if anyone's interested, you can still register till the middle of next week. So that's where you would register now.
So until that would be March 22nd.
Correct.
Is that about the cutoff is March 22nd?
That's it. So,
okay.
And really that's because I'm going to need to, as part of this, set up a virtual visit with your own state senator and your own person. So that takes a little bit of doing. So, but I'll show you under materials. Like I said, we have pre-recorded videos, that Lynn Breedlove's advocacy pep talk. We have Liz Hecht, who is the Family Voices co-director, talking about really why are we change agents? What's important? Why that we've talked about earlier, how important your own story is to making change. We then go on and talk about budget and policy issues, and Liz pre-recorded information on what's happening with children's long-term supports. And then we've had Joanne from Disability Rights Wisconsin talk about what's happening in the current state budget with special ed and children's mental health, really specifically looking at school-based mental health services. And then we have some great background reading. Some is a little more in-depth, it's kind of optional, but it will just give you a really good grounding in what's happening right now with the budget and policies. And then, like I said, and if we have time, we can watch it or afterwards, if anyone's interested, come to this website, and it's video 5. So it really is a great way. Barbara in 12 minutes tells you really all you need to know about taking the slice of your family story and creating a step-by-step guide, a worksheet on, okay, how do you put that into an ask for legislators? And you really have to think about what can legislators do something about, right? I mean, if you go to the say, I want something locally done, well, they can't always, or I want the whole Medicaid program to do X, Y, and Z. Well, they can't, that's kind of a federal thing. So you also have to kind of know what your legislator can do something about, and that's your ask.
That's a great point. Now, let me see if I'm understanding this right, though, Lynn. Is right now this page is live. It's out there, not just for registrants of the Advocacy for Change this year, but people listening to this now could go to a link in the chat box, if they could see the chat box, whatever, but they could go to the Family Voices website and they can listen to Lynn Breedlove give that introductory talk. They can learn from Liz Hecht and Barbara Katz, the co-directors of Family Voices, who have been doing this for years and are family members and experts in this field. That's open for anybody to go learn more about these policy initiatives, even if they can't make advocacy for change.
Absolutely. And I will definitely send you the link afterwards. So, right. And like I said, I think it's that developing your message and delivering it to legislators. And then the other piece, and I can send a link, is we talk about more broadly at the end of our day. And we talk about ways to engage in systems change. So maybe not, maybe for some people, going to Madison, coming to the Capitol, meeting with your state senator isn't what you want to do, but think about other things you could do. Maybe your child's a part of the Children's Community Options Program. Well, there are county advisory committees for those CCOP groups in every county, and they're always looking for parents. Maybe you have an issue with your school board. Well, go to a school board meeting and testify, or there's so many ways, write an editorial in your local newspaper. There's just so many ways that as families, we can make changes better. And I think about, for me, even, every time you go to the doctor's office or therapy visit or something else, they send you a survey, or they say, tell us, give us feedback. And I think we tend to go, oh, I don't have time for that. Well, you know what? That's a way to make your voice heard. Fill out that survey. Tell them what really was good and bad. Give them feedback. So again, that's a way to, maybe you don't want to go to Washington, D.C., but or come to Madison and meet at the Capitol, but give your, honest and insights when you've been to the doctor or therapist, or, you're getting diapers, you're getting, formula, whatever you're getting for your child. Well, you know what? Give them some feedback. Tell them how it could be made better. Maybe you have to fill out all this paperwork, which we all have to do. I had an instance recently where I said to the person on the other end, this is a lot of paperwork and I'm repeating what I'm saying. Could we just do it in a different way? And he said, you know what? Good idea. I'm going to send that up to the line. And actually they changed the paperwork. So, right. Wow. I mean, it's really using your voice and knowing and having the confidence that we're experiencing this every day. So, those people who are the providers who are serving families with kids with disabilities, they do want to know what's best for us. And we know, what works and what doesn't. So, I guess my point is that our day is about more than just, this one budget.
Right. See, and I love that, more than one budget, but you also bring out the important point of the fact that this is what you're living. You're living this every day. So you have this point of view. The legislators, the school board members, the doctors, they also have their point of view. They're looking at it from a different angle. And what seems obvious to you may not be obvious to them. And they're not going to understand it unless you share your point of view, unless you share what you're seeing. And so both sides have to be open to those different points of view. And then they can help each other look at the big picture and figure out what the reality is and how can we make it work for everybody involved. What I'm hearing you saying, it's not about, I want my way. It's about, I want the best way for my children. I want the system to work for everybody. And there are things that we can do to help change the system. The system is not perfect. The system does have places where it can be changed. And here's how it affects us and how we want it to change.
Exactly. That's exactly. So that's why, I'm excited that things will be on, that our things are, on our website, videos are there. I'm hoping people will share them with others. Certainly if you want to attend, we'd love to have you on March 30th and 31st or next year.
So there's still space for this year if people want to attend the virtual event. Okay.
But, if it doesn't work for this year, please use our resources, find ways that you can advocate and the levels that work best for you. And again, I'm hoping that our resources will help you have that confidence and find ways to use your own experience to make changes.
Yeah, you know your child, you know your experiences, and that's what you're being asked to share. It's that expertise. And do it with a partner. Do it with another family. Do it together.
Absolutely.
Man. It's so much more fun. Even though we may have to wear masks and it may be through Zoom, we can still do things together and we can still support one another. And that's the other thing that I love about Family Voices is you guys are huge on parents coming together with parents.
Exactly.
Any final things before we end? I know we didn't get a chance to see the video, but I really want to encourage people to go and listen to Barbara. She's a fantastic teacher. And so I think you'll really get something out of that. We'll link that along with, I mean, there's just more on there than I thought there were. This is me admitting as someone who's coming online going, I did not do all my homework. Yeah. Because there are some really cool videos there that I didn't know existed.
Well, good. Yeah. I mean, that's why we do what we do and why we're passionate about it, is that we really want to help others because, right, we've been through it. We know that there are barriers, there are things that just seem confusing or, and we're all busy. So, I mean, I think that with our fact sheets, with our online trainings, with all of our advocacy resources. We're really hoping people will, you know, whether it's 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. or weekends or whenever, get on and watch those videos or look at our fact sheets and share them with friends. So, you know, to kind of, you know, I think we're all, you know, we're kind of making our way through navigating new and different services. So that's why our resources are there to help families make that easier.
Well, and as you've learned with your son, and as I've learned with my son, it is a process of growth. Is not only are our children changing, but we're changing and the system is changing. And so to try to keep up on that and look ahead and maybe connect with other parents that have already been there is really an important tool to be able to get through whatever the next step is going to be, because we all have that next step. Is we're all going to be taking that next step. And so by leaning on each other, we're going to be able to be successful in that. Well, I'm going to bring you back. Okay. Just so you know, in a little while, we're going to come now in a few weeks or so, we're going to come back with Family Voices, because I really do want to talk about your online trainings. You guys do a ton of trainings. And I want to dig into those resources, as well as maybe touch a little bit more on the advocacy isn't just for once a year, but that there's a year-round sense of standing up and making our voices heard from our points of view as family members. So will you come back in a couple months?
Absolutely.
All right, then.
Thanks for inviting me. Tim, for some reason, I can't hear you. All right, thanks, Tim.